I'm Gavin Clark with the National Museum of Computing and Radio Museum, and we're interviewing former employees and customers of Digital Equipment Corporation as part of the 60th anniversary of DEC opening its first office in the UK. It's July the 3rd, 2024, and we are in Reading, and I'm here talking to John Barrett. John, let's start with the basics, please. Can you please give us your full name, your place, and your year of birth?
Um, I'm John Barrett. I was brought up in central Scotland in a place called Bathgate, which is midway between Edinburgh and Glasgow. I went to school there and was very fortunate to gain a student apprenticeship with a local electronics company when I was 16 years old. Very fortunate indeed, because they had just introduced a student apprentice scheme, and I was the very first one chosen to be on that scheme. During the next 5 years, I studied on a one-day-a-week basis at a Coatbridge Technical College, and during the week I had very practical experience in electronics. And so by the end of that time, end of a 5-year period in my early 20s, I had an HNC Higher National Certificate in Electronics Engineering with a very good background in practical electronics at that time.
And what was your kind of school experience growing up? Were you into technical subjects or?
Interestingly enough, in those days at the school that I was at a secondary school in Bathgate, and the top people at 11 years old were immediately put into a classics group, which was 2 languages, with maths, English, history, geography, all that stuff. And I was in that top group and immediately went to the classics group, and this didn't appeal to me at all. I enjoyed the maths and the physics, but Latin and French, not so much the spoken word, but the grammar and so forth, just didn't turn me on at all. So by the age of 15, 16, I was not enjoying school. And so this opening that came up for a student apprentice in electronics really appealed to me. So that was a big break for me. I was very fortunate.
And what were your parents back?
My father was a driver for various companies in the area. That's what he was. And during the war, he was an ambulance driver. And in the early 50s and 60s, there were very few people who had driving licenses. So he had jobs driving. My mother's family had a pub in the local town, which made us all well known, and it was a fairly busy pub. So Bathgate was a fairly friendly, buzzing county town in those days. A fun place to be, and with a lot of friends, a lot of activity. Close to Edinburgh, close to Glasgow. So it was a very good place. Had a bit of history. Robert Bruce's daughter had a castle there. So way back in the 14th century, there's history of a castle in Bathgate. In more recent times, it's famous for its golfing history, because it is, I believe, the only golf club in the world that has produced 2 Ryder Cup captains, both for Europe, I might add. One was Eric Brown and one was Bernard Gallagher, who went to the same school as me. And there's been a follow-up Ryder Cup player, Stephen Gallagher, who was recently recognised in the King's Awards. So ancient history, but in more recent times, it's sport. But I think Bathgate was basically, in the early 1900s, a mining town. Like a lot of places in central Scotland, they were producing coal to produce steel in the local area, to go to the shipyards in Glasgow and build ships, and that was the history.
Okay.
So when I was growing up at school, education was important, because if you wanted to get out of that environment, which was the local mining community, and the steelworks were the big employers, education was the way out. And that was one thing my father just kept reminding me. education. And he was a great influence in my life in terms of do something that you enjoy and you get pleasure out of, but what, put the effort in. And it had a big impact.
So you got the apprenticeship.
Yeah.
And was there an interview process? Did your parents put you forward? How did it kind of come about?
Well, it came about because I had, we had a friend who was the headmaster of the local night school, because in those days there was day school, but night school as well, which was to encourage people in employment to gain qualifications. So you would work during the day, but study in the evening. And he was the headmaster of the night school, and he heard of an opportunity through one of the lecturers who was a senior person in this electronics factory, and that's how the link came. He said, I'm looking for somebody to bring on as a student apprentice. And he was the person who linked me, who was unhappy doing the classics course, who was very interested in practical things, and was maths and physics and so on. And that's where the link came. So again, I look it back and think that was a really fortunate link. And that's what triggered it.
So you got the apprenticeship, and what kind of things were you doing on the apprenticeship?
Sorry?
What kind of things were you doing on the
It
apprenticeship?
was on the apprenticeship it was electronics, electrical engineering, physics, but in electronics, transistor theory and so forth, because transistors were just being introduced in those days. When we went to college, it was valves. And
what is a valve, just for the audience?
A valve was a device which you had to. It was a glass device which you was used to transmit, electronic signals and so forth. But it was so that's like what if you look at the very old during the Second World War. If you look at any of the electronics equipment, you'll see valves, and you'll see the glowing light of the valves, because the filament had to be there to get the temperature for them to operate. And then there was, during my time at college, there was the introduction of transistors, which were brand new. It was all theoretical before that. Then transistors began to, so things could get miniaturized much more very, very quickly. So that was a major, then there was the integrated circuit. But the introduction of taking over of transistors from valves was a major, major thing in the 60s.
So you completed the apprenticeship. What happened next?
I completed the apprenticeship, then took jobs with this company that I had been with for 5-6 years, a UK electronics company. It was taken over by Plessy. And I worked there for another couple of years. Again, it was a leadership role. Well, it was a role in tantalum. They were manufacturing what we call tantalum capacitors, which was a very complex operation. And I learned a lot there and got into a supervisory role there. And I was there for another couple of years, up until about 1965, I think, 64, 65. And there was a lot of discussion about the oncoming possibility of computers, how they would computing and how it would change people's lives. And there was at that point in time, there were two avenues in computer: analog computing and this forthcoming digital computing, small d, digital computing. And so I made a decision then that was a path to follow. And Honeywell Computers, who were a large manufacturer of mainframe computers at the time, had a factory in Scotland, not close to where I was living, probably 20 miles away. And they were building mainframe computers and shipping those across Europe. A main competitor was IBM, and again, this was the mid-60s. So they were advertising for young people with electrical degrees, electronic engineering degrees, or the equivalent, to join Honeywell and train as a computer engineer. In other words, the electronics of computers. So I applied for one of those roles and joined Honeywell Computers probably in 1965, I think. And we learned, they were taking on scores and scores of graduates from universities all over the UK. So I was fortunate enough to be chosen there. There was the mixture there. We were all in our early 20s, full of vigor and theory. And it was great fun. And they trained us on computing theory for about 3 months solid. We never saw a computer, we just saw drawings. And you learned the whole theory of digital computing. Again, small d. That was a great training ground, because what we ended up doing, it took about 3 weeks to build a mainframe from start. And now a mainframe computer could be a lot of electronics with mag tapes and so forth before it was ready to be shipped, mainly to the commercial industry and banks and so forth throughout Europe. So you would work, they put us on, we were on, because there was such a big order book, we were working days, afternoons or evenings, and night shifts. So there was a 3-shift system. And after that, when the system was ready, two of you would go with the system and install it at the customers, and that was a good experience. And it meant if you did a good job and it travelled well, you could install it fairly quickly, and then you had 5 days, and most of it was in southern Germany, which was very enjoyable. It was a great eye-opening for me, because it took me from building the computers in a factory to actually seeing how they were being used. And that actually made it even more interesting for me to see. And in those days, again, I will remember this, it's the mid-60s, when you arrived with a computer system arrive in a small Bavarian town. Everybody in the town knew it was coming. The bank manager was there to welcome you. The place would be ready with false floor, air conditioning for this. And you were seen as somewhat of magicians who could take this thing and put this all together, and eventually it would spew out and do something useful. So that, for me, was extremely satisfying, and it made me think more of being on the customer side than being on the production side, and that. And I did that for about 18 months, when I then saw an advertisement in a Scottish newspaper from an American company called Digital Equipment, who I had never heard of, looking for a computer engineer, hardware computer engineer, to be their representative in Scotland. And I thought, So there was no Google at the time. How do you find out? And I eventually discovered that this was a small Massachusetts company who built scientific computers, which to me, which identified in those days as the first mini computers. And that appealed to me because it gave the opportunity to be closer to the customer, because it was being used by the scientific community. It would be hospitals, universities, research establishments. And funnily enough, typesetting was a big industry at that time. They were selling a lot of equipment into newspapers, and a lot of the UK newspapers had it. But that was the opportunity that I saw, that I could get more hands-on and get closer to the customer. But I have to say, the main appeal of the job was 3 months training in the United States, because I had never heard of the company. And I thought, 3 months training, I was still a single guy in my early 20s. Because in those days, in my hometown, anybody who had gone to America never came back. It was a one-way street. Now, here was an opportunity to go to the United States for 3 months and come back. So I followed up the application, and I got a telegram inviting me for no emails then, telegrams, inviting me for an interview. I knew that. So the interview was at Paddington, the hotel at Paddington Station, and I met a guy called Ken Senior, who had been with Honeywell, so we had a thing in common. And I got on. He came across and presented a very appealing picture of a company, small company that had big plans. And I spent 2 or 3 hours with Ken. He explained what the job was and would be based in Scotland, although he did at the time, because I was single, say, would you like to come and work in the United States after a couple of years? But that was a side thing. Anyway, I got a job offer and joined DEC in August 1966. And that was an interesting experience, because having been a well-established American company, Honeywell Computers, who employed hundreds of people up in central Scotland, I arrived with my offer letter at Reading Station and ready to go, stay overnight in Reading and go off to the US for 3 months. And it turns out there was an airline strike on at the time, so I arrived. I had said goodbye to everybody in Scotland, see you in 3 months. Off I went. I got to Reading Station and said, can you take me to Digital Equipment? Never heard of them. What's the address? So I get my letter. Castle Street. Castle Street. Wow. I said, I think, well, let's go to Castle Street. So I went to Castle Street and they let me out, and there was a furniture store with a little door to the side. He says, that's it up there. So I thought, oh my God, what have I done? So I was with my case for 3 months. So I went upstairs and there was nobody there. And then eventually somebody came in who had been a secretary, I can't remember her name, who was working part-time, and she said, oh yeah, I think we're expecting you. So that was it, that was the start, and I was there for 2 weeks.
And what was the office like? We hear about the stories above.
It was just very basic. There were a few desks, a typewriter, and modules, DEC modules all over. And that's what she was doing. She was logging those in my time. Ken Senior was Ken was actually a working manager at the time. He was a working engineer at the time.
So what was Ken's job at this
Ken
point?
was the European Customer Services manager. So his job was to, well, his job was to install computer systems, keep them running, and hire new people. So so he wasn't there, but he was in Germany, I think, installing a system. But I was there for a couple of weeks, and eventually then flew over to the US, to Boston, for 3 months training.
So you go to hang out in Reading for a few weeks. It's kind of the first step out of Scotland, I suppose, apart from the trips to southern Germany. What's Reading like at that time?
It was, the beer was different, that's for sure. Bitter. I then met a guy called Ken Parker, who was in the same position as me. Ken had been hired from IBM as a large system computer engineer. So he started a couple of days after me. So he arrived in Reading at the same time. So we were in the same boat. So we read manuals and did things, and I think we visited one place at Aldermaston. I can't remember entirely. There weren't many customers around.
Did you get out and about in Reading at all?
Yeah, I stayed at the Pangbourne. At the Copper Inn had just been refurbished. It's now called something else now, but it was very nice. We had to get by bus out to Pangbourne and stayed in Reading. I can't recall much of that was different in Reading at the time. There was just loads of pubs, and I remember that. And I stayed out in Pangbourne for most of the time, so I got to know a few people there, and that was a nice part of the world. The local hotel owner and the local bookie. who came into the pub for a drink every night. So I was there, so we became friends. That's all I recall. And then we flew off to the US.
And what was the atmosphere like in the office, the DEC office in Castle Street?
There wasn't much. There wasn't not much. We just sat and read. There was nothing happening, and most people were out there. I never met a salesman. Ken was still traveling in Europe. We kept in touch with him by phone. And the thing that had been delayed, the airline strike had stopped us getting onto the various courses. So we just filled in time. I think it was about 2 weeks. The strange thing as well is that after saying goodbye to everybody in Scotland, I was there back home the next weekend. And that was funny. I'm the next weekend after that, and then I went. So there was people doubting if I'd really gone. But that's what I recall. And then
so you get to the US, to Boston.
Yeah.
And what's that like? So it's your first trip to the States?
Well, the US in those days, I can tell you, just like I described there, I mean, I had relatives in Canada and the US, and there was always letters back and forward and presents at Christmas, and you had this impression of, and it was a much better off lifestyle. Things were much more available, and people had a better lifestyle. There was cars, and there was all sorts of things that were different, and it truly was. When you got there, it was like a different world. It was people went out for breakfast. You know, you get that here now, but in those back here, people went out for breakfast, and even a Sunday morning was something. This is strange. They were choosing to have breakfast after church on a Sunday morning, have breakfast in Howard Johnson's and places like that. That was very different. But the overwhelming thing was one of friendliness. I mean, they just, you were welcome with open arms, welcome by the deck people, and everything was, you were all in one big family. And the people on the courses that I was on, they were from all over the US, and some other parts of, nobody else from Europe, because we were just building up Europe at the time, but you met guys from all in the same age, generally. There were a lot of people who joined the US organization then at that time, not interestingly enough, who had come from the forces, Air Force or Navy, because those were the people who had some of the best electronics training at that time, were the forces, not necessarily commercial companies. That was interesting. So, but it was overwhelming, you know, from top to bottom in deck. It was a friendly environment, first name terms, people always willing to help, and it was a great environment. So there was no barrier. It was an easy environment to come into.
And what was the training like?
It was
classroom based.
It was very, very thorough. Yeah, it was. Again, the training instructors came from the forces, so there was a discipline there. But you had to work, and there was tests, and you know, you got feedback. It wasn't an easy street. You had to put the work in. You were expected to put the work in. We were put up in a motel, and we got what was called a per diem, so much allowance. Oops, was that?
That's your phone.
Okay. Oh, it's my phone. Sorry. So you got what we call, it was my first introduction, I think, called per diem, which every Thursday evening you got money to spend. So that was for, the company picked up the hotel and food and so forth like that. So that was. So it must
have been quite an eye-opening experience for someone of your age to be.
It was, yeah. It was remarkable, and then Ken Parker was there. And then there was another. Dave Lawrence arrived. I first met Dave Lawrence, who's well known now, who became the plant manager here. But Dave joined DEC a few weeks later, and we were in the same motel for 2 to 3 months. And so I got to know Dave Lawrence and Ken Parker pretty well. So we were a UK little community in a motel, and we organised ourselves for the evenings and weekends and so forth. And that was good. We had a car between us, and so at weekends we got around and saw a bit of Boston and the area. And that was the period we were there was the autumn, so it was New England in the fall was beautiful, and the weather in general was pretty good. So it was a good time to be there. So, and I used the opportunity I had relatives in New York. There was a guy in the course who was traveling up and down to New Jersey every weekend. So he used to drop me off in New York, and I would go to relatives, and it's one of these guys who left Scotland and never gone back. And so that was good, and I was able to go to Washington for a weekend, and at that time, John Kennedy, the president, had only been shot 3 years before, so there was still a lot of that around, so going and taking photographs around Washington. Those were, certainly for somebody as young as I was, it was great.
Did you get a chance to fly in the famed deck helicopter fleet at this point?
Later on, there was no helicopters then, but later on, as I went back to join deck and went back as not on training courses, but as a manager going to meetings, yeah, I went on the deck helicopter but those were not there when I was on the training course in the mid-60s. It was in the 70s before these came into place. But there was a deck helicopter service, yeah, between Logan Airport and the plants around Massachusetts. I believe at one time that DEC became the biggest employer in Massachusetts. So we had plants and facilities all around west of Boston, north around and south, all around there.
What was the helicopter experience like?
It was interesting. They would take you around Boston Harbor if you wanted to see and see that. So it turned out the guys were mainly US Air Force pilots a few of them had talked about their Vietnam experience. So but no, it was fun. It was a really exciting way to get from the airport to the facilities in western Massachusetts. And I think a lot of customers who came from the UK, for example, or anywhere, but particularly the UK, would comment on it. They loved to be picked up by a helicopter and taken to where they were going, because that was something certainly unique in those days.
So you come back to the UK from your training, and what's your kind of role when you come back?
Well, it was I came back. I remember coming back on the Friday, and I had messages for me that there was systems down at Edinburgh University and Glasgow University. Nobody had told me, so I was straight into it. I was straight in that weekend. The weekend I'd hoped to have off. I remembered that. I worked Saturday, Sunday. I hadn't seen my family for 3 months. And but I do remember that there was one irate customer at Edinburgh University who was, and anyway, we got it sorted out. But that was okay.
What was the system? PDP-8?
No, it was a PDP-7 with graphics, which is fairly complex. In the computer-aided, I still remember it, the computer-aided design department at Edinburgh University. And when you got the interesting thing, because of the way that DEC, the market that they were in, it wasn't a commercial market, the scientific market, a lot of these people, particularly professors of the departments and the heads of the department, they knew the innards of the computer. They knew more as much as I did about the theory of, what should happen and so forth. So it was quite an interesting thing to come into. You straight in, and this computer isn't working, and they're expecting you to come straight up a training course. Their expectations were high. So it wasn't an easy environment, but it wasn't a difficult environment, but it was pressure, because it had been a different environment in Honeywell where people were just hands off and said, "You're the expert, you get on with it." But they knew the innards of the computer. They had ideas of what this problem might be. Because the software in those days wasn't so sophisticated. Most of the problems that you got in those days were hardware problems.
So how would you fix them? How would you go? You
have to trace it to component level. There was boards within the computer system. So in those days we had to go in, get it running. There's fault finding techniques using an oscilloscope, looking at signals and then deciding because there was no spares. There was no spare boards. That came later. There were spare components, so you had to change. If it was a transistor, you had to find the transistor in this whole thing. That's what the training was all about.
And would you have to replace the transistor?
Yeah,
Soldering
you had to take it out, solder it. We had in the training kit, in the kit, the service kit that you got as an engineer. Yeah, you had a soldering iron, solder, components. And you had to you had to fix it to component level. Yeah. Eventually, it went one stage further. You would trace it to, as the boards became more complex with integrated circuits, you could trace it to the board level, and then you have a spare board. That became. But in those days, you had to trace it to component level, which was a big challenge.
And you were you're the first deck employee in Scotland.
Yeah.
And your responsibility is customer service, is that correct?
Yeah, for installations and keeping the systems running. So I had everything from Carlisle. I had Carlisle, Newcastle to Dunray was my territory. So
A lot of time on the road?
there was a lot of time on the road, yeah. And I remember telling we got a shilling a mile. Not 5p, a shilling. It was a shilling a mile. And
how did they get you? Would you get a phone call or a telephone?
Oh, that was another story. When I first came, it was my home number. So my home number was DEC. And there wasn't a lot of customers, but they were mainly in, as I say, research environments in university. And I was single at the time. Still, I hadn't moved out of home. And my mother would, I mean, you can imagine, in the early days of computers, I would go in at night, and my mother's, I'm waiting for you to come in. Doctor such and such has been on from Edinburgh University, and there's been a crash. And to her, a crash was casualties, you know? A crash, that's Jesus, no. The system's crashed. No, he says that, don't panic, it's a crash. But those were the sort of things that, it was funny. And I would get, and she got to know some of the customers, and there was one at East Kilbride, I mean, she got to know him quite well, and I said, you look after Dr. Smith, because, you know, I think he's a good guy. Just make sure you look after him. So I was getting that sort of stuff, which was, in today's environment, would be so funny. And then we used, to take the service calls, the company set up, we used a service company in Glasgow that took the calls and then passed them out to us. But we had no mobile phones or anything. We had to call in each morning to find out what the jobs were for the day. Well, I had to. And that was the way it ran. And the interesting thing in those days, other than typesetting, which, you know, newspapers had to go out on time, people were willing to wait. You know, if the call, unlike today, if you put the call in on a Monday afternoon, it was likely to be Tuesday morning before I would know about it. And then you call the customer, and then so there was, time had a different dimension to today. Although, as I said, typesetting was, newspapers had to go out in time, and they were different. And that was a very different environment. One interesting aspect of the typesetting environment, it was the days when they were, in the mid-60s, introducing for the first time computing to the typesetting of it. And the typesetters didn't want it. And you know, and we had even though I was the only one in Scotland, there was a 7-day, 24-hour contract for the Scotsman in Edinburgh and a newspaper in Dundee. That meant I was on call. So I've had calls in the middle of the night and gone out into the Scotsman in Edinburgh, and you look around, these guys, they don't want you to be there. They don't want this equipment. And you go and you find out that there's a plug being pulled out from, and people are saying, oh, we didn't know that. And that was their way of, we don't want these computers here. But that was typical. But you just had to grin and bear it. And even the management, there was not much they could do about it. They just had to, that was the environment. But the rest was,
the opposite experience was like you were also supporting Peter McFarlane at
Yeah, well, Peter,
and
for
that's Glasgow Infirmary.
Glasgow Royal Infirmary during Peter was a good example of an interesting application, a really great interesting application. He won a grant for a PDPA system, which had analog to digital conversion capabilities, and Peter put together. His plan was to put together a capability to measure electronically some of the things that were done by hand, or some by before, and have the computer diagnose waveforms and so forth. And that was interesting working with him to do that, because I knew the PDPA and the ATDs, and he was doing the other side of it. So we were both in our early 20s doing this. There was some Hewlett-Packard analog equipment used as well, but it was mostly DEC equipment. And he did the programming, and it was really interesting to see that develop, just from and that was a good example, because you could see, I mean, these people were queuing up in this department to see they had to see a cardiologist and be measured individually, whereas what we were then able to do through Peter's development was actually have the computer to analyze the waveforms and save time and that's basically, it was a lot more complex than that, but basically it was to have the computer analyze the waveforms and make an initial diagnosis so that they could, better utilize the time of the experts. And so it sounded fairly basic, but it was really interesting to be involved in it and see it develop. And as I said earlier, Peter's boss wasn't too sure. He was an older professor, head of the department, and these computer things were not, he wasn't too sure about them. And it had cost a lot of money. And he kept coming inside, and Peter and I would be up to here in cables, connections, and he would go away shaking his head. But eventually, I know that Peter won him over, but that was a good example.
So how does DEC Scotland grow over time? And you start rising up the ranks, don't you, in terms of support responsibility?
I would say in Scotland, we started hiring other engineers in Scotland, because at that time, Scotland was the domain that I was in. But there was growth all over the products that the company was introducing. They then started to introduce the PDP-11, the 16-bit, with Ristus and operating system, RSX operating systems, etc. And they became very, very attractive to a lot of customers. And they moved towards the commercial market. There was Ristus was the system that brought, and a lot of small companies, software companies, began to develop. So the DEC system, the hardware and the operating software, and they then developed the software to suit their particular application or industry. And that's when it started to take off really big time. And it was taking off everywhere. And Scotland were no different. About a couple of years after, I would say the first couple of years I was there from 66 to 68, very little, it was small growth. Still universities, still research establishments, shipyards, design in the shipyards, buying DEC equipment. And then as we got closer to the commercial applications, it began to take off. And so in Scotland, to be specific, we decided we'd open an office. We needed to open an office, particularly to house the capability to better support customers. And that was mainly from a customer support viewpoint. So the first decision was where we have the office. And so I was given the job of saying where we should have the office. So I decided between Edinburgh and Glasgow, although we had one or two salespeople at the time then, not many salespeople, who wanted it. Some group wanted it in Edinburgh and one wanted it in Glasgow. And my position was, hey, the way this is going, we're not going to be spending we're not going to be having a lot of people back in an office. Why have it in a big centre? So have it in the best location for transport. So we decided to make the office between Edinburgh and Glasgow that was also east-west and then easy to get up to Dundee, Aberdeen, and that's what we did. We opened. But one of the funniest...
Where was that?
That was in Livingston. That's when Livingston was quite a small... It had one big US steel factory processing plant at the time. And there was an office block built and we took 1,500 square feet. But one of the funniest things I remember was that I was told, you know, and the UK management, I think it was Dave Lawrence at the time, said, "Can you make a proposal for an office? We need an office, yeah. Say, here's the reasons we need it, and where's it going to be, and here's why this is a good place, and here's the cost, basic cost, and so make a business case." So I did it, and he said, "Oh, it needs to go to 3 places. We need, you know, you need to send a couple to Reading, one to Geneva, and keep one." And believe it or not, I had one piece of carbon paper. And people won't remember carbon paper. There was no printers, there was no typewriters even. So I had to write out by hand a 4-page proposal with one piece of carbon paper and then write it out all again to get the office. And then we got the office and we opened the office there. And it was 1,500 square feet, I remember. And we hired people there, we set up a logistics and so forth. And the company, and Scotland was part of the North UK, called district. It was a branch within the district. The North UK district was all of the north of England, Scotland and Ireland. And Dave Granger, who you've interviewed separately, he was the North UK district manager, and as I became Scottish branch manager for customer services. And I reported into Dave Granger, who was in Manchester. And as the company grew, Dave moved to Reading to run the UK operation. When he moved to Reading, I was invited to take over the North UK, which meant moving from Scotland, which is a big issue, but huge issue. But we moved, and about the mid-70s, we moved to Manchester. So I got promotion and became responsible for the north of England, Scotland and Ireland. So still had Scotland. Then about 4 years later, growth again. Dave Granger moved back to the US. I was then promoted from North UK to North European region, which was all of the UK, Ireland, and the Nordic countries. So we moved to Reading. I moved to Reading and to take that up in probably 1977 time.
And what's Deck like by this point? And what's Deck like by this point? It's obviously growing and growing.
Oh, it's growing, and offices opening, and we set up. We opened an office in Belfast. We opened an office in Leeds. When I was in Manchester area, we opened offices in Leeds, Aberdeen, Livingston was open, and there was offices opening throughout the UK. That was the key growth time.
And you said now you're a manager as well. One of the key responses was just trying to hire good people.
Yeah. Well, as I look back as a leader in Deck and growing at the rate that we were growing.
What kind of growth rates are you talking about?
We were growing at over 30%, 5 years in a row at least, you know.
And how much is headcount growing by?
Sorry?
And how much was headcount growing by?
It was growing by probably 15-20% a year. So it depends which areas. London was growing faster than others because of the commercial market, but it was growth. And as I look back, yeah, most of our time was actually spent as leaders, as managers, hiring good people. And that was and our policy was just hire the people that fit. You know, there was technical skills required, but there's also attitudinal skills and customer relationship skills.
So what was a fit then? What was considered a good fit, apart from the technical attributes?
It was an affinity with customers, somebody who would understand it from a customer viewpoint, and who had that instilled in them, see it from a customer viewpoint, and have the affinity to take on new skills, but as well as the technical skills. At a certain point in time, we were just looking for technical skills, but it was very clear, and this was what I think this is one of the smartest things we did. We started in the customer service organization anyway, I could speak for that. In Europe, we decided that if we were going to continue to be successful, we needed to identify leadership potential early on. So what that meant, all the people that we'd hired, 90% of the people that we'd hired, let's say in customer services, had to have strong technical skills. The other 10 to 20% were in administrative roles, logistics and so forth. We needed them to be good as well, but in the technicals. So the majority of the leadership came through the technical channels. Not everybody who's technically skilled is a good leader. And we just, that's something you discover. And one of the smartest things I think we did was to put in place management identification, leadership identification potential at the technical level. And we introduced a thing we called it the Phase 1 Management Training Course. And we introduced that in the UK and throughout Europe, but the UK one we particularly were close to. And that's where we would set a criteria for identifying management potential, and there'd be a 1-week initial training course, and we used to have it off in a hotel down near Swindon somewhere, where we started with. And we had criteria for senior managers to identify these are the things that people have to be good at before they come through. And then there was a 1-week training course, and it was introduction to leadership skills, marketing, people management, and that was fairly thorough. And we started it on a Sunday afternoon, and that was on purpose, because we had some of our managers come to kick off the process, because people thought, Jesus, they're serious about this. Because I remember one manager saying, you won't get anybody. You want anybody to come in on a Sunday afternoon to a training? I said, well, we'll get somebody else. So that didn't last long, because people, once you got going, and we had a manager there to kick off the training course, and then at the very end of the course, on the Friday, I went and met them in the UK, met them and talked to them on the morning of the Friday, and then set them before that, the day before, just the afternoon before, we'd set them a task which was related to a real live task in the service environment. And then they would share that feedback on the Friday afternoon. That was the process we used. And it was extreme. Obviously, it had to be fine-tuned as time went on. But I remember the detail of the early course, and it produced some excellent leaders and managers. And as I look back, that was probably one of the best things we ever did. And it was a foundation for a very, very successful customer service organization in the years ahead. And that was one of the things that actually was the foundation, in my opinion. But it meant commitment it wasn't just, we'll send you on a training course. My management team were involved in it, and that was good for them. And it also showed those people there was a commitment there. We wanted this to happen. We wanted them to be successful. And not everybody was successful, but out of it came some outstanding managers and leaders who went on to, other companies. And I'm sure they would look back and say that was that attendance of that type of management or leadership course was fundamental in the path that they took in their career.
And how did DEC, I suppose, cultivate the training courses are a big thing? Was there kind of a proactive attempt to kind of push managers attempting to kind of push people forward and move them into new opportunities as well?
They were encouraged to put people forward, yeah. But there was a mechanism there because some managers might put somebody forward for the wrong reason because somebody was desperate to be a manager, and we had to deal with those sort of things. But those sort of got dealt with because, again, as the company grew, there was opportunities building, and you know, there was a lot of movement in the UK from people who maybe grew up and did the course and were an engineer in Bristol, we got an opportunity in Birmingham and so forth. So it actually worked. It worked pretty well. There was people who, most of the time, it was successful. There were people who didn't make it, and people who were disappointed because they thought they wanted to be a leader, but and there was an environment. It's difficult to. You create an environment of people at that level who come through and are very, very good, and there's a peer pressure and there's a peer acceptance, and it raised the level. Some people didn't make it, and some people would be probably quite bitter about it because they never made it because they still believed it. But I believe, all in all, it had a good positive impact on the health of the organization.
How do you think this differed to other tech companies? Were they other companies doing anything similar to this?
No. Well, I used to keep in touch with some of them, but I do believe in that regard, over that period of time, DEC were a bit unique in that regard. I wouldn't say, oh, we were so good, but I used to keep in touch with the Hewlett-Packard customer services direct and the ICL people, and I do believe for a period of time we were unique in that regard. Although everybody was growing and they needed, but I would say we did as good a job as anybody during that time. I wouldn't say a better job because that's for other people to. But we got good feedback from people looking out, looking in, and at a certain level we would send people off to courses outside DEC. Leadership courses. I mean, we at the very senior level we used Harvard a lot, and we used the universities in France as well a lot, INSEAD.
Where did I suppose the impetus for this kind of thinking come from? Was like phase one? Ideas come from you guys internally, or were they kind of told to
this was a European initiative. There was a European. When I was in the we were all parts of it. When I was running the UK, when I was responsible for UK customer services, initially it was UK and Nordic, I was a representative. There was 5 European areas, and all 5 of us would, and with staff in Geneva, headquarters in Geneva, we'd meet monthly. That's where it triggered. We decided we needed to do something. And Pier Carlo Fallotti, who was the leader at the time, he was the guy who, he had more impact than him. He rubber stamped it and get on with it. And he set and we put the things into place. He said, right, we'll put the money aside for this. He put somebody in place who was the equivalent of us, a staff member. And he had appointed somebody, for example, and he made it happen. So it came from that. But the practical implementation had to be done in each country. So we had the English equivalent in English, and so. But I would say he was the guy that triggered it. But we grabbed it with both hands and I was part of the decision making, and then came back and said, right, let's put somebody in place and get this. And
And what about initiatives? Were there initiatives to attract more kind of women to the organisation, for example?
Yeah, there was quite a few. There was quite a few females came through that, because there wasn't a lot of. I said earlier that 90% came through the technical, in so much as 90% of that 90% were male, but there was a few females came through that and were very good. I remember a number of them. And it was good to see. We had during that time we did introduce. Seems strange now. With the first female managers within the service organisation running, which unheard of a number of years before. Females running the service organisations, various service, and that was good to see, and they were very good. So there was, I think that there was a feeling yet they would like to see more, but there was only a certain number that it was governed by the thing I said earlier. 90% of the technical people were male, so. But there was a number of females came through, and it was a good opportunity for them to, and they were successful.
So this drive is designed to, this overall drive is to kind of increase the intake and raise the next generation of managers.
Yeah.
To kind of help grow the company and serve the customer.
Yeah. With a heavy customer orientation and the customer service, but actually prepare them as sort of general, introduce them to marketing and business management and budgeting and so forth, so that they could put a budget together, they could put a plan together, they could. Some of it also at the corporate level, there was a strong lead there. Pier Carlo Filori was part of the corporate group, but at the corporate level, a guy called Jack Shields, who was the corporate customer service thing, he was the strong believer in it as well. So it filtered down. It was very strong in customer services, extremely strong. And it became part of the culture. It was, have you been to INSEAD? INSEAD was a place in France where a lot of our people went to. And people like Jim Lynch, and you talked to Jim.
But then you created the customer, you had the remote diagnostic centre and the customer support centre as well. These became important as well because the company's growing, the system's becoming more complex
we
as
had
well,
the demand. Yeah, the system, everything's becoming more complex. At the same time as you're growing, there's demands from the marketplace to keep systems running, minimize the downtime of systems, because it was very different from the 60s when most of the problems were hardware problems. As you get into the 70s and 80s, system problems, combination of hardware, software, as we get into networking and complex systems. And so there was a drive, an internal drive to, because the early model was whenever a customer had a problem, you sent an engineer. He didn't even do any diagnostics. He didn't even ask them, oh, system's down, right, we'll send an engineer. Now that's an expensive way to run an operation. As the systems became more complex, you had to have a there was specialist areas and so forth. So you had to be able to do that. So therefore we introduced more intelligence at the front end. So when somebody called with a problem, system problem, it was more and more undefined. It's doing this or doing that, or drops out at this time or that time, or dropped out during the night. And so you had to have more intelligence at the front end. So we the concept of instead of every organisation in the UK, every office had their own they called into their local geography office. We decided that the more complex systems, it's better, instead of taking them through a local office, take them as quickly as possible to the person that will understand the problem. So that we had customer support centre, and that had real good technical people, well experienced technical people on the end of a phone who could help. But then we enhanced that by saying, hey, a visit to from an internal productivity viewpoint, sending customers out to every time you get a call is expensive. Even a telephone call is expensive. But if you could get them to a remote diagnosis without anybody being involved, that's even from an internal effectiveness viewpoint. And if it can meet the customer's requirements. So we introduced this remote diagnosis capability.
Which was what? Literally dialing up the computer?
This was dialing up the computer, and we had invested in the computer diagnostic software. We had built it such that if you dialed into the thing, it could diagnose without any human involvement. So nowadays that looks straightforward. This was groundbreaking stuff, and took all the best brains of the company to put it together. It was very challenging. And at the same time, we decided in the UK and as we were getting more and more systems and networking applications, it was very difficult because we had a software organization, a hardware. So a customer is not going to tell me call the hardware. So it doesn't sound like hardware. Call this up. We said, right, we need one center. And that's where we decided in the UK to have one center. And that's where you see Laurie Cattell, the software manager, and me.
And that's in Basingstoke.
That's in Basingstoke. We decided to put a center in the UK that would take the customer calls, whether they're just hardware, software, whatever, that we would handle through one, get the best software skills and hardware skills under one roof.
And it had a very specific response time rule, didn't it?
Eh?
A very specific response time rule.
Oh yeah.
No more than 3 rings, I think.
Yeah, there was very heavy. There was measures of
Was it a 3-ring policy?
There was a 3-ring. It was fairly well defined. I don't know what it became, but there was measurable. So we put things in place, measured them, and reviewed them, improved them, tried to improve them, always understanding what was happening. So that concept was introduced, and we went to Basingstoke. We decided we had to make a presentation to get the investment in the UK, because it was decided at the time we would have it was a corporate investment to put this remote diagnostic capability together. And I was managing the UK at the time, and as part of the European operation with Pier Carlo Fallotti, he was the European manager, and so I went with him he decided he was going to have a European centre in Valbonne in France, and I went with him, and him and I went to this place in Valbonne, beautiful location. He said, I said, Pier Carlo, this is a long way from. He said, yeah, but we want the best brains. And I'm not bringing them to the south of France and connect them and then you'll motivate these people, you'll get the best people there and provide the best. That was his concept. And the only people on site, and it was this place in Valbonne, it was an Air France ticket centre. It was all the computerized ticket centre, or booking centre. And we chose a piece of geography there. And then I said, hey, we said this. 40% of the European market was English speaking, was the UK. I said, Pier Carlo, our customers calling France, and so we said, hey, I think we need a centre in the UK as well, 2 centres. And he agreed. He said, yeah. So we had to go and make that proposal to the corporations. That wasn't easy. So I made the proposal. I can say it now. I can still hear the voice of this was to the corporate group, and they were no easy.
This is in the US?
It was in Europe, but it was once a year the corporate group came to Europe. This was Jack Shields and his group. Jack was the king of customer services, and he was a little guy, but powerful personality, unbelievable. Anyway, they were all around the table. We made Pier Carlo introduced it, and we had did the presentation that we should put, and Pier Carlo was called it Basingstoke. So now we have a proposal here, as well as we want some investment money, Valbonne in France and Basingstoke. So we always called it Basingstoke after that. And I made the proposal, and halfway through, this voice came from there's been 30 people around this big table. The voice came and says, why should we invest corporate money in the country that's got the worst record for the implementation of corporate programs? I thought, Jesus. Pier Carlo stood up. No, this is, but that's where we started from. But we got there.
And that was Britain he was talking about.
Eh?
Britain had the
that was
worst
UK he was talking about, and that was Jack Shields. He was the boss, and I was fairly new to it, so I could.
How did you persuade him?
We swayed them by the performance of the organisation. We put a lot of effort into a big measure of success in customer service Europe, or customer service corporate wise, was what the customers thought, and there was annual survey, there were surveys sent out and ratings, and the balance was the business management of it, and do you use your resources correctly, and so forth. So that balance, but overwhelmingly, it was customer satisfaction. And during that same time, the customer satisfaction of the customers in the UK was not high. So we decided that was going to be our primary objective. To cut a long story short, by the time it came to this, just shortly after that, we had the top branches in Europe, in the UK. London had come #1 in customer satisfaction, and Manchester. So we had a swathe of branches that were, and that was recognised within the company. So Jack began to recognise that, yeah, the UK was, and he was very supportive after that, and he recognised that, and he came and he opened. He did the official opening at Basingstoke, Jack Shield. And he also was very supportive because our performance gained credibility, and he changed.
And you said you tried, you couldn't do this in Reading for what reason? You tried to just...
We couldn't get. There was two things. One, we had used up every building that was become available in Reading. At that time, our technical support people were down in an old brewery building, which flooded every time it seemed to flood every time it rained. So it wasn't in good condition. But so we needed new facilities. We could have probably done it in Reading, but we were using we had plans for Deck Park at that time, and a proposal came forward that, hey, why don't we just go outside the Reading and go south instead of back towards London. And Basingstoke, we already had a sales office in Basingstoke, so we decided on Basingstoke.
But you could have developed a new site here in Reading.
We could have.
You chose not to.
It was just planning was going to be. It was going to be more difficult. We were in the middle of we started the Deck Park planning. That was a big, and we decided to do it in Basingstoke. I can't remember all of the reasons. I remember part of the proposal was, and by the way, the planning was going to be easier. That was for sure. So we could do it quicker. I remember that was one key. And there was also talk of having a dual carriageway between south of Reading and Basingstoke. It still hasn't happened, but whether that made any difference. But it was going to be easier to do. Otherwise we probably. There was a pressure that was there too many people in one location? If any, there was always a thing in Deck. It came from Ken Olsen. I don't want any community to be so dependent on Deck that if something happened, it has a big negative effect on the community. So be careful. I don't know. There was some unwritten rules around that, and we were probably getting close to that in Reading, particularly with Deck Park coming along. And engineering had decided that they were going to be investing in the Reading area as well.
So Deck has got a huge, to focus on Reading briefly, has got a large and visible footprint now in Reading.
Yeah, huge.
And how significant was the arrival of Deck Park, do you think?
Well, it was great because it brought everybody, all these people that would meet at meetings and so forth in different buildings and so forth came together. It was a very positive thing because it was a modernly designed building. It had open plan upstairs and it had a street, which a lot of people still. And it was unique at the time because on the street it had the restaurant for the employees. We had some facilities at the back, which for repair facilities, which we needed to get the planning permission. But it had a bank and it had a shop, and so it was like a street, and people would meet on the street and tick tack tack. So it had a nice feel to it. Upstairs were the offices, and it was open plan offices. There were some closed doors, but it was I think most people enjoyed it, and it created an atmosphere of it supported teamwork, and people would just walk along to see somebody or walk along where it would be difficult before. It enhanced I thought it was a big positive thing.
And how do you think it compared to, say, other British employers?
Well, I can only compare, and at the time I moved from a British employer, which was a long time before that. It's difficult to say how compare with British employers at that point in time. All I know is that when I did my student apprenticeship in a British company, which they were great, they were a great company, I owe them a lot. But the standards were that I would be, you know, when it went to, I would be with the workers at coffee time, which was fine. If you had a brown coat, when you became a supervisor, not a brown coat, a grey coat, you had a different coffee time. If you had a white coat, you then were waiter service. So there's all these different things. And the same with toilets. You could, I mean, in the US, well, so the US thing heavily, you know, just a digital UK became, you know, was just part of the US.
You had an integrated kit, everyone's eating in the same place.
Took up the US, or that US way of working, not a UK way of working. So, and people responded to that, you know. First name terms, talk to anybody, you know, that's the MD, I talk to him, talk to Jeff, or whatever. That environment was obviously for DEC was set in the US. And we had a lot of things that we could do when we were growing, exciting things that HR could do and so forth. But I've always looked back on that and said, well, we were very fortunate. We're in a growing environment. You can do a lot of nice things. And hopefully companies will, when you're growing, you can afford to do nice things. When you're not growing, it's a different proposition. But
we'll just talk briefly about, you obviously Jeff Shingles gets a lot of attention. You said there was another managing director of
Darryl Barbie. Yeah.
Tell me a little bit briefly about Darryl Barbie.
Well, we had a matrix management structure. So a lot, say for example, when I moved to Reading to be the North European customer service manager, I had a boss in Geneva, customer services European manager, which at the time was Pierre Calafalotti. I also had a UK boss, which was the UK managing director, which when I first moved from Manchester was Darryl Barbie. Darryl had taken on the UK, or the North European job based in Reading, when Jeff Shingles, who had moved to Geneva to be the European marketing director or vice president. So Jeff, when I moved to Reading, my UK boss was Darryl Barbie and my European boss was Pierre Calafalotti. It was the matrix management. And a few years, Darryl managed the UK subsidiary probably during its highest growth period. He was a Californian guy, liked the UK, loved the golf here, but he was a very, very good he was a sales manager, but general manager. Excellent guy to work with, and was a great individual to run DEC during a 5 or 6 year period. And he was great to work with and for. I'm trying to remember the year now. There was when Jeff Shingles came back from probably the mid 80s. He came back from his role in Geneva, and Darryl left he left DEC and set up Sun Microsystems in Europe. And that was, so you can see the type of guy he was. He took it from scratch and grew it remarkably over the next 6 or 7 years, but he stayed in Europe. So he had a big impact on, I mean, clearly Jeff Shingles also had a huge impact on the leadership of DEC, but Darryl should not be forgotten. Many people will have fond memories of Darryl. Fairly quiet guy, but very, very competent, and a great guy to work for, and a pleasure to work with. And I still keep in touch with him. He's in the US, he's retired in Florida, plays golf 3 times a week. And yeah, another excellent guy.
So tell me, just because keeping an eye on time, what obviously Deck is no longer with us. What was your story? You've risen quite far with Deck at this point. Did you move on from Deck? Were you there through the acquisitions?
What did I do? I left Deck in '94.
What made you? What? How come? Why did you?
Well, I took redundancy. The company was. It's clear that we were struggling. Some new management had come in from IBM.
How did that change things?
Just I think it was probably late then anyway. It was in a spiral. It had missed the PC market. We had moved into manufacturing our own integrated circuit with major investment there. So we had, at one end, we were putting billions into integrated circuit manufacturing, and at the other end, we were taking on the big consulting companies. And so we were really spread, and our strength was in technology and networking in the middle. And I think during that time, Hewlett-Packard couldn't believe what was happening around, because there was, Deck looked like they'd walked away from the. And then you had Sun Microsystems did well at our expense as well, where Deck looked like it had defocused. And I think the partnership, which the partner programs where we had part of our Deck success had been to develop this capability where partners would buy Deck hardware and write their software, and Deck would support them. That fell apart a bit, and so that was.
So how did the management change it? Because this new team had come in. They were IBMers as well. How did that?
There was a lot of IBMers came in.
Well,
it just seemed to be. It was completely different.
How was it different?
Every way.
What was a key way it was different?
They were more interested in themselves. It was very clear. And I'll give an example. One of the guys who came out, he was, I won't mention his name, but he arrived in London to come to visit, and he became the UK the worldwide sales manager. And the first thing he did was book 3 suites on hotel, one of the hotels in Park Lane, stretch limo, and all of that, and that was how he started the whole thing. And that was only part of it, but it was clear when you were in meetings that. But to be fair to them, I think Deck was already.
But the culture,
the culture was one of looking after themselves. No, clearly. In my opinion, just on the behaviour.
Do we start seeing the unravelling of the Deck way at this point?
Well, people started to leave. Sad, I left the same time as Jeff Shingos. The whole, we just took the opportunity because we could see that the old Deck was gone. And I left before it was taken over by before Hewlett-Packard, and before any change had taken place. So in '94, I think it was later in '96, was it, before they were taken over?
It was late '90s, it was the Compaq acquisition.
And then Compaq, I left before Compaq. But you couldn't, when it was got to the stage of being unable to influence things, there was different decisions being made. Ken Olsen had gone, and it looked like the company was drifting. It's very difficult to describe because things that you could get done were no longer happening. But I think part of it was because we had all of the attention for a period of time was on reducing the headcount, which for us was a big, and we spent a lot of time managing headcount and managing the organisation. But that was new to us. And that takes a lot of management attention. We tried to do the right thing by everybody. Whatever anybody says, we did try to do the right thing, but it just became, you were laying people off, and then the next quarter, Jesus, bloody lay more off. And it looked like that drained you. And it was like working with a different company, sadly. And you can only hold on to what was very precious. But for the last year that I was with DEC, it was a very different place, and it's a very different place.
So tell me just briefly, I asked you most abiding memory, and you gave me some examples about some of the work projects you've been involved in individually. There was the work on the fitting GPS on the QE2 and in the North Sea on oil discovery. Just tell me about some of those projects.
Yeah, no, some of the interesting thing in my early days, as I look back now, they were really big steps. There we were in Scotland dealing with, in the late 68 it was, only 2 years with digital, dealing with these, hospitals, universities, research establishments mainly. Then you get a call to go along to the dry dock at Greenock, where the QE2, which was front page news every day at that time, people, because it was delay after delay, but it was going to be the pride of the Clyde, and it was delayed yet again. But to go along there and install a PDP-8 on the bridge of the QE2, meet a guy from the US who was a partner who had developed this hardware which went with the PDP-8, which basically Cunard wanted this technology to help to reduce the fuel bills when they went across the Atlantic. I didn't realize it, but when you cross the Atlantic, you can be, you don't stay up. You're governed by the tides and the winds and all the rest of it. I don't know much about that. But anyway, there was 4 US naval satellites at that time. This was 1967, 68, had been launched. I mean, this was around the time of the moon landing again. Well, it was the late 60s was the moon. Around that time when it was all excitement about, we're going to get to the moon by the end of the century. Anyway, these US satellites, what this equipment did with the PDP-8 on the bridge, with an aerial on the top of the QE2, we were sat in dry dock, and the guy, we switched on the PDP-8, installed the PDP-8, put this equipment on, and he would look at his watch and say, well, there's one coming over, and let's switch it on, and then you could see the PDP-8 start calculating. And what he was doing was, you could only catch it every 6 hours. You get a great signal, the best signal. And it would calculate the longitude, latitude and longitude of where the ship was. And then we were in dry dock, and it came down with this, after all the calculations, the printout came, latitude and longitude, and it gave it within so many yards of each time. It was like magic. And so that was an interesting application of with the DEC computer and latest technology. It wasn't called GPS at the time. I don't know what it was called.
It's a form of positioning.
Yeah. Then we started to get calls. It was at the time that there was a possibility of there was large amounts of oil underneath the North Sea. How the hell were we going to get it? And then we started getting calls. We had an office at Livingston at the time, and we get calls from the US to say, can you get an engineer? I went once up to Inverness, and it was a ship, a small ship, research ship, and on it, guess what, a PDP-8 with this equipment on it. And it was fairly secretive. We're told only to talk, there'd be a guy there, only talk to him, don't talk to anybody else. Don't talk to anybody else that you might see in the vicinity. It was, I thought it was CIA stuff, but it wasn't. It was just oil companies wanting to be first to the find. And again, what it was, they were plotting the North Sea, and it's okay saying there's oil there, but where are the reserves of oil? So what they had to do was do the equivalent of get a response from a depth chart so that they could tell. But they had to link that with their exact position, and that's where this equipment, so they could map it. And that's how they mapped. And we got caught. There was people going out of Inverness, boats, small boats. Mostly it was American, mostly top secret. Don't just send the bill to this address in New York or wherever, or Texas. And it was all very secretive. But again, it was the use of this technology, and out of that came, it was, you know, it was PDP-8s and this basic technology that allowed them to map the North Sea. That was some of the early uses of technology, which we didn't realize at the time how significant it was going to be. That would be one of the memories. Many more.
Well, tell me just briefly, what do you think is DEC's legacy then? Obviously, it's not around anymore, and you can debate. Some people say it has now. What's its legacy, and what's its been impact on you? So, legacy to the world, and its impact on you.
Well, I think it has a legacy in technology. There's a lot of technology that people would recognise today that DEC had. DEC had a involvement in. I think I sent you that article, which I thought, did you get it? I thought that was quite a good one, which talked about database management and networking and so forth, where it's recognised that today that DEC took some of those early steps. Maybe they had to sell off that capability to other companies. Other companies have taken it and moved it on. So that legacy is still there. And I think the other legacy that's there is the people that talk fondly of DEC still. When you meet ex-DEC people, no matter where, there's an immediate, oh God, yeah, you were an ex-DEC guy, and you were in DEC. I don't know if you get that with other companies, perhaps you do, but I certainly feel it. I mean, we in the UK have got a Dexodus, it's an ex-DEC community of over 1,200 people. And the membership is still growing, strange enough, and DEC after close to 30 years. And but overall, there's a fondness, and I see it online on other DEC sites, DEC corporate friends and so forth. And you're always getting these from people who have worked with other best company I ever worked for, great environment, and those sort of things. I think there's a warmness and a.
What do you think is responsible for that? Why do people respond so warmly to DEC?
I think it was the environment that was created. Whether you can finger that on one person, probably Ken Olsen created the concept, but it was established. It was taken and grown and developed by the people, not just the leaders, but the people within the company. And there's a fondness there that you can't. It's difficult to describe, but when DEC people ex-DEC people get together, there's a fun, and it's not too. It's easy to get nostalgia. You got to be careful. Just nostalgia taking over. That can be a bit off-putting for other people. I think there is a genuine good feeling about how that company was. I see it almost all the time, and that's great. And I feel good about that. And
do you think DEC has a legacy on where we are in Reading? Is its footprint still felt, either the diaspora of people or the physical, what it's done for town?
It's difficult to say because it's a long time now. I think at the time that it did, it had a big impact. But I think there's probably not a lot of people that know that DEC were one of the first IT or computer companies to base themselves in Reading. And I think that's why this project is good, that it's not going to be forgotten. It's not going to be just something that people talk, but there'll be something permanent there that reminds people. It was and it played an important role in this community. And, you know, you have to say that the fact that there's many, many thousands of people now employed in the IT and telecoms industry in the Thames Valley, DEC were one of the first to come here and decide to come here, and you know, and that should be recognised, and it's good that will be recognised through this project. So I think this project will help to establish that.
What do you think DEC's legacy is on you? What's it left for you?
On me, gee, I think it made me hopefully a well. As rounded a leader as just one could be. I think DEC's style wasn't to roar from the front. It was you were encouraged to, you know, think quality. and give people a sense of purpose, but give them the skills to do the job and encourage them to do the job. That's the style that they encouraged and related to me. And whether I developed that through them or it was a bit of both, but it suited me, that type of environment, rather than being somebody who's up front all the time and and in front of a microphone and so forth. But be clear about what the objectives are, what we're trying to achieve, and get the best possible people with you to achieve it. And that has never forgotten. I've always, since I've left DEC, that's always been my policy. I learned it at DEC. I got a lot of good training, a lot of good mentors, people who I learned a lot from, and hopefully that's within me. And hopefully I have used it to good effect in other places. That's for other people to judge.